Hey everybody, welcome back to Info 3370, studying social inequality with data science. Today we're pivoting into a new module on opportunity as measured by economic mobility. We'll talk a lot about how people's family of birth affects their life chances on down the road. Our learning goals for this particular class are to argue about economic mobility as a measure of opportunity, and also to frame economic mobility as a prediction test question. This will set us up in the future to think about studying predictive models alongside questions about economic mobility. Before class, I asked everyone to read this paper from Chetty et al. 2014. And in class, we discussed it a bit. In particular, we discussed the ladder metaphor. So the authors talk about imagining the socioeconomic hierarchy as a ladder. And if you're at the bottom rung of the ladder, you're at the bottom of the income distribution. The top rung of the ladder is the top of the income distribution. The authors argue that the probability of rising from the bottom rung to the top rung has actually stayed the same over time, but what's changed is that the ladder has gotten taller. So the top of the income distribution has become increasingly high incomes, and the bottom has stayed down low, so that the probability of upward mobility is about the same over time, but the consequences of upward mobility for your own income have risen. So some of the evidence they provide to show that the ladder has maintained the same structure over time is this graph showing the mean child income rank on the y-axis for sets of kids whose parents landed at various income ranks across the income distribution. So at the bottom here, we're thinking about people who were born and raised at the bottom of the US income distribution. On average, when they grew up and became adults, they landed at about the 35th percentile as adults. Whereas those raised at the top of the US income distribution, they land as adults at about the 65th percentile of the income distribution. And what's remarkable in this figure is that the pattern is the same for the three birth cohorts that the authors look at. So those born in 1971 to 74, 75 to 78, and 79 to 82. So the structure of upward mobility here hasn't changed a ton over time. They also look at the probability that a child born in, say, the bottom quintile of incomes, the bottom 20%, rises to the top quintile of incomes, the top 20%. And that probability has remained at about 10% over the entire birth cohort series they look at. Meanwhile, the probability that someone born at the top of the distribution remains at the top of the distribution has stayed relatively stable at about 30% over this period. So these two graphs provide some evidence that the probability of rising from the bottom to the top, or being at the top and staying at the top, those kinds of probabilities have stayed about the same over time. So what's changed is trends in absolute mobility. In this follow-up paper, the authors and some new co-authors look at the fading American dream, and here they try to quantify absolute income mobility. So instead of your probability of being at a certain percentile of the distribution, what's your probability of having an income higher than some threshold? One threshold they look at is your parents' earnings. So they ask what percent of children go on to earn more money than their parents earned per year. In the 1940 birth cohort, so people born in 1940, it was almost everybody. Over 90% of people went on to earn more than their parents. And by the cohorts in the early 1980s, it had fallen to about half of kids going on to earn more than their parents. So what changed over time? Here we're looking at a graph that shows the income distributions of those in the 1940 birth cohort. So this blue density at the left shows the distribution of parent incomes. So for those kids born in 1940, what's the distribution of their parents' incomes? Then the red curve shows the distribution of incomes for those same kids when they grow up and become adults. What we see is this huge shift. So what was the 80th percentile of the income distribution of the parents is only the 14th percentile of the income distribution for the kids. So almost all of the kids end up earning more than almost all of the parents. And in this kind of world, you can see how it was the case that 90% of kids went on to out-earn their parents. Contrast that with what we see when we look at the 1980 birth cohort. In this birth cohort, the income distribution of the parents and the kids is like about the same. So it's no longer the case that you're sure to earn more than your parents because children's incomes are just not going up as much. And so over time, there's not as much of a probability that you'll go on to earn more than your parents earned. And so what this means is that while the probability of upward mobility has stayed the same roughly over time, the probability that a given child out-earns their parents has fallen. These results are really powerful because they tell us something about opportunity. They tell us something about how our lives are determined by the luck of what family we happen to be born into. We can generalize these ideas. So if we imagine a graph like the ones we've just been looking at, where we have each person represented by a dot, and we have the parent's income along the x-axis and the income the child goes on to earn as an adult on the y-axis, we can imagine a few hypothetical scenarios. One is a scenario of equal opportunity. The average income that a child goes on to earn has nothing to do with the income that their parents had when that child was being raised. On the other extreme, we can imagine a world of perfect intergenerational reproduction. In this world, each child would be expected to earn, on average, the same amount that their parents had earned when that child was growing up. So in this world, you might be able to predict the child's income perfectly, given information about the parent's income, whereas in the equal opportunity world, knowing the parent's income is useless for trying to predict that child's income. So this takes us to a new framework for thinking about economic mobility. There is a lack of opportunity if you can predict a child's outcome given information about their parents. This is a powerful pivot because it allows us to move away from just one variable, parents' income, to the consideration of a whole host of variables about your family background that may constrain your life chances. We could say that we live in a particularly rigid society that lacks opportunity to the degree that we can predict kids' incomes as a function of things about their parents. And that's the kind of questions we're going to tackle in this module, where we begin asking questions about prediction using the tools of data science and relating those to questions about opportunity and economic mobility. So today we talked about economic mobility as a measure of opportunity, and we framed economic mobility as fundamentally a prediction question, which sets us up for next class when we're going to talk a bit more about a particular form of this prediction question that we'll engage with in classes to come.